Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam Hilchas Machalos Asurais, Perik Sheni Halacha Aleph. And the topic is a negative commandment inferred from a positive in relation to the animals that were forbidden to eat. The Rambam starts the chapter with the following words. Michlal shenemar b'chol behema mafreses parsa b'sheshas shesa shtei feroses malas gera b'behema eisa techelu. If we take the Torah's words and it talks about an animal that has split hooves and chews its cud, those are the animals that you may eat. From that we can infer that if an animal is lacking those two signs, that it is forbidden to eat. And this is an inference of a negative from a positive. And the Rambam says, V'lav haba meklal esa esahu. A negative that comes from, that is inferred from a positive, has the status of a positive commandment. And what does that mean? A positive commandment does not carry within it the penalty of malchus, of lashes. Then he continues, U'begomol u'bechazir u'barneves u'b'shafan nemar lo yiseichlu mimali hagera mafrisi aparsa b'geimer. When it talks about the four animals that have one of the signs, the camel, the pig, the arnevis, and the shofan, they're controversial what exactly they mean. Those are the four that have only one of the two signs. The pig has the split hooves but doesn't chew its cud, and the other three chew their cud but don't have split hooves. And the Torah says you're not allowed to eat them. Well, what about if it's lacking both signs? It neither chews its cud or has split hooves. So the Rambam says as follows. Halamadata. From this verse we know shehem below tasa ve'afapi sheyesh behen siman echad. From this we know, from this verse, that it's a negative commandment, despite the fact that there's only one sign that's missing. V'kol shkein shar behema tmeya v'chaya tmeya m'shein bo siman klal. How much more so, kal v'chomer, any other animal, domestic or undomestic, that doesn't have any of those signs, she'isar achilasa b'lei tasa. Yeser al eser haba machlal osa techelu, that it has a negative commandment associated with it, a lotasa, in addition to the fact that it's based on an inference from a positive statement. So in other words, if you eat an animal that has no signs, it is a violation of both a positive commandment and a negative commandment. The Rambam is anticipating the question and responding to it. There's a general rule in Shas that ein mashirin and ein einshim min adin. You do not base a penalty, a prohibition with a penalty, based on a kal v'chomer, based on the logical argument of deducing a major case from a minor case. Even though it's one of the methods with which the Torah is interpreted, the exception to that rule is if you're using it to establish that there is a punishment that is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. This is the Rambam's shita. But how do we justify it here? How do we justify using a kal v'chomer to give you a penalty? So the Rambam's answer is, it already has a prohibition derived from a positive statement. Since it already has a prohibition, it's not as if we're creating a prohibition out of thin air. We already know from a positive commandment that if it has no signs of kashrus, that it is forbidden. Therefore, we could even use the kal v'chomer to establish that there's also a negative commandment, and which would give the penalty of malchus. The Mishnah Melech here, the commentary on the Rambam, quotes Tosfos in Psachim. From the Tosfos, it's clear that the Tosfos disagree with the Rambam's principle over here, that if there's already a prohibition that comes from a positive commandment, then we could use the kal v'chomer to make the negative commandment apply as well. So let's try to understand the crux of the dispute between the Rambam and Tosfos. According to the Rambam, if there is a positive commandment that dictates that something is forbidden, in this case, an animal that has neither of the two signs, then you could use the kal v'chomer to give it also the status of a negative commandment. Tosfos disagrees with that principle. And Tosfos seems to be more logical because whatever reason is that you give a penalty based on a kal v'chomer, why would it not apply over here? So the logic must be that the Rambam holds that since we already know that the Torah forbids this, it's not really called a kal v'chomer establishing the prohibition. It's not establishing, it's just categorizing it. as not only being a positive, it's also being a negative. The Aruch Ner, in his commentary on Masechta Makos, says that the Rambam and Tosfos go l'shitasam, follow their own opinions elsewhere. And this takes us to the laws of Eidim Zomamin. In Hilchas Eidus, Perik Chav Halacha Beis, based on the Gemara, that if two witnesses come, testify about crime committed, and another two witnesses come and say, you were with us at that time that you testify that you saw this crime being committed, and you were in another place with us, the Torah says that those are called Eidim Zomimim, perjured witnesses, and they get the penalty that they wanted the accused person to get. What happens if they wanted, let's say, the person who was accused of murder to get the death penalty for murder, and they were perjured this way? They would get the death penalty. But the Gemara says, what would happen if the death penalty was actually carried out? That the witnesses who testified falsely actually had their testimony come to fruition and the accused was executed. The witnesses did not get the death penalty. It's counterintuitive, of course, and it's based on the words of the Torah. You should do to them, or to him, as they conspired, shezamam lasas, as they conspired to do to their brother. Kasher zamam, v'loy kasher asa, as they conspired, but not as they actually did. But even though there's a kal v'chomer, if they conspired, they get the death penalty, even though it didn't carry to the actual death penalty. How much more so if they actually caused the person to die? Well, einayin shemin adin, you don't give penalties based on a kal v'chomer. So this principle is stated in the context of a death penalty. What about if it's for monetary matters? So Tosfos in Bava Kama makes it very clear that it doesn't apply to monetary matters, and he gives two reasons. One reason is monetary matters, it's never really fully implemented because you could always return the money. So it's not as if the punishment was carried out and nothing could be done to reverse it. It could be reversed. Therefore, you could use this principle of kal v'chomer because it's not really the same as something that was fait accompli. And another explanation is that the whole principle of ein shemin adin only applies to a penalty, not to monetary matters. The Rambam adds in Hilchas Eidus, Perek Chav Halacha Beis, not only to a death penalty, but it also applies Ablaim Laka Zeh Shehidu Olav Loken, that if the person against whom they testified received the penalty of lashes, these witnesses will also get the lashes. Tosfos clearly disagrees with that. Tosfos says it only applies to money. It doesn't apply to any other penalty. The Rambam says it applies to death penalty and lashes as well. So what are they arguing about? So the Aruch Ner says when it comes to Eidim Zomamin, there is already a negative commandment in the Torah, lo tana, you're not allowed to bear false witness. There are no lashes for false testimony because it's a lab she'ein bo ma'aseh. It's a negative commandment that has no action. It's transgression. When you transgress saying a false testimony, there are no actions involved. And a lab she'ein bo ma'aseh, the halacha is, if it doesn't have any action, you don't get the lashes. But nevertheless, we already know that there is a prohibition for this witness, for these witnesses to testify falsely. So when you already know of the prohibition, then you could use the argument of a kal v'chomer. Then you are able to punish based on a kal v'chomer. Just like by us, in the case of the animal that has neither of the two signs, the Torah only mentions the prohibition if it has one of the signs. It's lacking the other one. Kal v'chomer for two. But we don't make kal v'chomers when it comes to punishment. But we do, the Rambam says, in this case, because we already know that there's a prohibition based on the inference from the positive commandment. Therefore, we could use the kal v'chomer to establish that there's also a negative commandment. The same thing by witnesses. We already know that the witnesses who testify falsely have committed a crime. True, granted, it doesn't have malchus, doesn't have lashes. Same way a positive commandment doesn't have lashes. But nevertheless, there is an established prohibition. Therefore, we could use the kal v'chomer. Tosfos, on the other hand, disagrees with the Rambam's very premise. Just because we know that it's prohibited based on a positive commandment doesn't give us the right to use a kal v'chomer to impose a penalty, whatever the penalty is, a penalty of lashes. to someone who committed a more serious crime, because you don't give punishments based on kal v'chomer. The fact that we already know the prohibition from another source, in the case of witnesses from Lotanin, don't bear false witness. In the case of forbidden foods, it's based on the positive commandment that you should only eat those animals that have both signs. So therefore, the Rambam and Tosfos are consistent with their own reasoning elsewhere. The Rambam holds that as long as there's an established prohibition in one place, we could use the kal v'chomer to increase the prohibition to one that has the penalty of lashes. And the same thing with Edom Zomerman, that once we know that the witnesses have violated a law of the Torah, true that it doesn't have lashes, we certainly could go and then use the kal v'chomer to say that there are lashes because of the kal v'chomer. And Tosfos disagrees with that premise, and that's why they hold that even with regard to lashes, not only the death penalty, the witnesses would not get lashes once the penalty was imposed.